The pain began on a Tuesday morning in April. Magnus Rasmussen was 34 years old that spring. He was a broad-shouldered man with hands the color of oiled leather from 10,000 days of outdoor work, and he had never in his life been sick with anything worse than a winter cold. And when the pain first came into his lower right side, he did not at first understand what a serious thing it was. He thought he had strained a muscle lifting a fence post the previous afternoon. He told his wife so at breakfast. He drank his coffee. He went out to the barn. By noon, he could not stand upright. By evening, he could not keep water down. By the middle of the night, he was calling out in a voice that his wife would later remember as not being his own voice at all, but the voice of some other man who had climbed inside him and was trying to get out through his throat. The nearest doctor was 36 miles away in the town of Grafton. Ilse Rasmussen saddled the mare in the dark at 4 in the morning. She rode the 36 miles between the small sod house and the doctor's shingled office in 6.5 hours, and she found the doctor, and she paid him $7 in coin from a small tin she kept behind the flour barrel, and she rode back beside him at a slower pace because the doctor's horse was old. They reached the sod house at 2 in the afternoon of the second day. The doctor was a careful man named Petrie who had been doing what he did for 28 years. He walked into the small back room where Magnus lay curled on his side, and he looked at Magnus for perhaps 30 seconds without moving. And then he turned to Ilse in the doorway, and he said only 3 words. "I said, I am sorry." Magnus Rasmussen died at 11 o'clock that night. He did not speak in the last 3 hours. He held Ilse's hand for a while, and then he did not have the strength to hold it any longer, and Ilse held his instead, and the small dry pressure of his fingers around hers went slowly from the pressure of a man to the pressure of a hand that had no man in it. Their 2 small daughters slept on the other side of the muslin curtain that separated the back room from the front. Ilse did not wake them. She sat beside her husband for another hour after he had stopped breathing, and she watched his face by the light of a single tallow candle. And she did not weep because the weeping had begun somewhere deep inside her, the moment the doctor had said those 3 words at the doorway, and it had been going on quietly and steadily ever since. And it was going to go on for a long time yet, and there was no reason to interrupt it. They buried him on a low rise behind the sod house in a piece of ground that faced south across the open prairie. Ilse did the digging herself. 2 neighbors came the following day and helped her set the small pine marker Magnus had cut for a hog pen the previous autumn and had never got around to using. The marker had his name on it and the 2 dates and nothing else. Ilse had asked one of the neighbors, a Norwegian farmer named Tollefsen, to carve the letters. He had done it with the point of a chisel by the light of an oil lamp on his own kitchen table, working slowly because his English was not good, and he had wanted to get the spelling exactly right. The name of the older daughter was Solveig. She was 7 years old that spring. The name of the younger was Elin. She was 5. Ilse Rasmussen was 30 years old on the day she buried her husband. She stood at the edge of the small mounded grave with 1 daughter on either side of her, and the wind came out of the northwest across a country that had turned green only in the last 2 weeks. And she looked down at the letters Tollefsen had cut into the pine, and she made herself a promise then that she did not speak aloud, because there was no one within 100 miles she trusted enough to speak it to. She promised herself that the 2 small hands she was holding, one in each of her own hands, were going to stay on this piece of ground. Not on a train back to Minnesota, not in her sister's small house in the town of Wilmar, not in some other woman's care while she went out to work as a hired girl in Grafton. Here, on this claim, in the small sod house her husband had built for them in the 2nd summer of their marriage. She did not know yet how she was going to keep the promise. She only knew that she had made it. The summer of 1883 went by. The autumn went by. The first winter without Magnus was hard but not catastrophic, and Ilse got through it the way she got through everything now, which was one small task at a time without letting herself look too far ahead. She milked the cow, she fed the hens, she patched the sod walls where the frost had cracked them. She read to the girls at night by the light of a single candle 1 page from an old primer she had brought with her from Ohio when she was a bride. And she made sure her voice did not shake even on the pages where the reading was about fathers, or homes, or the small quiet doings of families that were still whole. The spring came. The summer came. By the autumn of 1884, Ilse Rasmussen was 31 years old. She owed $62 to the dry goods merchant in Grafton, a man named Prescott who had extended her credit through the summer with the patience of someone who had already begun to calculate what her land might be worth when she failed to repay him. She owned one milk cow named Solve, three laying hens that had begun to slow their production with the shortening of the days, 47 acres of unbroken prairie, and two small daughters who were now respectively 9 and 7 years old. Solvig had grown tall for her age that summer. Elin had not grown at all. Both girls slept in the same narrow bed at the far end of the sod house, curled together the way they had always slept. And Ilse could not remember a night in the last 18 months when she had not stood in the doorway of the back room for a moment before she went to her own bed and looked at the two of them, and felt in the small dark below her ribs the exact weight of what she had promised herself at the graveside. The winter of that year came on early. She felt it in the air by the second week of September. The wind, which had been running warm out of the southwest for most of August, swung around one afternoon and came out of the north with a note in it that she had not heard so early in the season since the year she had come to the territory as a young bride. She stood in the yard with a wet sheet in her hands, hanging laundry, and she felt the change on the back of her neck, and she stopped what she was doing and looked at the horizon in the north for a full minute. The sky there was the color of a pewter plate that had been used for 100 winters and cleaned with sand. She finished hanging the laundry. She did not say anything to the girls. That afternoon, Rune Kjelstad rode up the wagon track that ran west from his own claim to hers. She saw him coming from a long way off. Rune Kjelstad was a big man on a large plow horse, and the two of them made a shape on the horizon that was recognizable at a mile. And Ilse recognized it at a mile and a quarter, and had time to smooth her apron and step out of the sod house before he had covered the last quarter of the distance. Han dismounted at the edge of the yard. He did not tie the horse. He let the reins fall across the pommel of the saddle, and he came forward on foot with his hat in his hands. Rune Kjelstad was in his middle 40s that year, a broad-chested man with a red-blond beard shot through with gray, and he wore a wool coat that his wife Hedda had patched twice at the elbows over the previous winter. He was not an unkind man. Ilse had known him for 6 years. He had helped Magnus raise the roof beams of the small barn in their first summer, and he had brought a full quarter of beef to the sod house on the second day after the funeral in 1883, and his wife Hedda had sat with Ilse for 2 hours in the front room of that house on the third day, and had not said anything, and had not tried to say anything, and had simply been there, which was what Ilse had needed. He stood now at the edge of her yard with his hat in his hands, and he did not come further, and Ilse understood at once before he had spoken a single word what he had come to say. He said, "Mrs. Rasmussen." She said, "Mr. Kjelstad." He said, "I have been thinking about coming out here for 2 weeks. My wife told me to leave it be. I am not going to leave it be." She did not answer. He looked past her at the small sod house. He looked at the low roof and the single south-facing window and the small stovepipe that stood up out of the sod like a black finger raised against the sky. He looked at Solve the cow standing in the small pole corral to the east of the house. He looked at the pale gray horizon in the north. Then he looked at Ilse. He said, "There is no shame in it." She said, "Mr. Kjelstad." He said, "Let me finish. A woman alone with 2 small children this far out, with what is coming this winter, there is no shame in it. My wife has a cousin who runs a boarding house in Fargo. She would take you and the girls for the winter. In the spring, you could go on to your sister in Minnesota. There is no shame in going. I have been thinking about it for 2 weeks. I am telling you now." He stopped. He turned his hat once in his hands. Ilse looked at him. The wind came across the yard from the north and lifted a loose strand of hair from beneath the edge of her bonnet, and she did not move to put it back. She looked at Rune Kjelstad the way a woman looks at a man who has come a long way to say something he believes is true, and who does not know and who will not know for another 2 years and 4 months, that the woman he is speaking to is holding in her small dry hands a piece of knowledge older than his grandfather and heavier than his claim. She said, "I thank you, Mr. Kjelstad. I thank you for coming out. I know what it cost you." Hi waited. She said, "I am not going." Hi said, "Mrs. Rasmussen." She said, "I know what you are going to say. I know it is the sensible thing. I know my husband would say the same thing if he were standing where you are standing. I am not going. The girls and I will winter here." Rune Kjelstad looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at his hat, and he turned it once more in his hands, and he set it back on his head, and he touched the brim of it, and he said only one more thing. He said, "If you change your mind, you send Solveig on the horse to my place, and I will come at any hour of the day or night. Do you hear me? Any hour." She said, "I hear you, Mr. Kjelstad." I mounted the plow horse. He rode back the way he had come. Ilse stood in the yard until the shape of him had gone over the low rise to the east and was lost against the pewter horizon. And then she stood in the yard for another 5 minutes without moving. And then she went back inside the sod house and closed the door and put her back against the door and stood there with her eyes closed for perhaps a full minute. Solveig was at the small pine table with a slate and a nub of white chalk. Elin was on the floor beside the stove with a rag doll her mother had sewn for her in the summer of the funeral. Neither of them asked what Mr. Kjellstad had wanted. Ilse opened her eyes. She went to the wooden chest that stood against the west wall of the front room. The chest had been her mother's chest and her mother's mother's chest before that, and it had come to Ilse across an ocean and across a continent, and it had a small brass keyhole in the front that had never in its life held a key because there had never been anything in the chest worth locking against anyone Ilse had loved. She knelt in front of the chest. She lifted the lid. She reached down through the folded quilt at the top and through the small stack of Magnus's shirts that she had not yet been able to bring herself to give away, and through the small parcel of dried lavender her sister had sent her from Minnesota in the summer of 1882, and her fingers closed on a piece of paper at the very bottom of the chest that had been folded 4 times and had been sitting there for 4 years without being opened. She lifted the paper out. She closed the chest. She stood up. She went to the small pine table where Solveig was working her slate, and she said to Solveig quietly that she needed the table for a little while. Solveig gathered her slate and her chalk without a word and went to sit beside her sister on the floor. Ilse sat down at the table. She unfolded the paper once. She unfolded it a second time. She unfolded it a third time. She smoothed it flat with the palm of her hand. The paper was brown, and it had a soft nap texture from having been folded and unfolded many times before it had been folded for the last time and put into the bottom of the chest. Across the full surface of the paper, in the careful, precise hand of a man who had been a builder all his life, was drawn a cross-section of a room. The room was drawn in ink. It had been drawn with a steel nib pen and a small tin of India ink, and the lines were fine and true and did not waver at any point along their length. The room was 8 feet deep, measured from the surface of the ground down to the tamped earth floor. It was 10 feet long. It was 7 feet wide. The walls were vertical. The ceiling was a row of 6-inch round timbers laid crosswise, covered with straw, covered with tamped earth. There was one ventilation shaft drawn at an angle of 45 degrees from the ceiling of the room out through the ground to a point on the surface. There was one entrance, a trapdoor in the ceiling of the room framed with 2-inch plank. Around the drawing, in a small, precise hand, were notes in a language that was half Norwegian and half English and half something that was neither, because it was the language a man speaks to his own daughter and to no one else. Ilse sat with the drawing spread flat on the table, and she read the notes. She had not looked at the paper in 4 years and 1 month. She had folded it up and put it in the bottom of the chest on the same day she had unpacked her mother's chest in the sod house in the second week after her arrival in the territory, and she had not touched it since. She had not needed to touch it. She had known that it was there. She had known what was on it. She had known for 4 years that a day might come when she would need to unfold it, and she had known that on the day she needed to unfold it, she would recognize the day for what it was. The day was today. The day was the afternoon Rune Kjellstad had ridden away from her yard with his hat in his hands. She sat at the small pine table for a long time, and she read the notes, and she looked at the lines, and she remembered. She remembered a summer afternoon in the year 1880, 4 years and 3 months before, in the kitchen of her father's small frame house on the outskirts of the town of Wilmar in Minnesota. Her father had been 61 years old that summer. He had been a small, compact man with hands like her own and hair that had gone completely white in his 58th year and had stayed white ever since. His name was Osmund Vinje. He had come to America from the Gudbrandsdalen Valley of central Norway in the year 1871 at the age of 52, and he had brought with him nothing but a small canvas roll of joiner's tools and the knowledge of a trade that had been his family's trade for 6 generations. I had been a builder. He had been a particular kind of builder. I had built in his 40 years of work in the old country, 3 deep-root cellars of the kind that no one built anymore. The kind the old men in the valley called stabber under Jordan, which meant roughly storehouse under the earth. He had learned the technique as a young apprentice under a master named Olav Gresseth, and Gresseth had learned it from his own master, and the line of masters ran back into a time in the valley when winters had been longer and food had been scarcer, and men had understood in a way that most men no longer understood, that the earth itself was the largest and steadiest heat source that any human being would ever have access to. Osmond had taught none of what he knew to a son because he had never had a son. I had taught it over the course of many summers and many kitchen tables to Ilse. On the afternoon in the year 1880, she was now remembering she had come to visit her father from the sod house in Dakota Territory alone, without Magnus, because Magnus had been in the middle of the wheat harvest and could not leave. She had ridden the train from Grafton to St. Paul and from St. Paul to Wilmar, and she had come up the walk to her father's front door on a Tuesday afternoon in July, and her father had been sitting at the kitchen table with a folded sheet of brown paper in front of him and a steel nib pen in his hand. Hi had looked up when she came in. Hi had said sit. She had sat. Hi had drawn. He had drawn for perhaps 2 hours. He had drawn while she made coffee for the two of them, and while she cut bread for a small supper, and while the afternoon light came slanting in through the west-facing kitchen window and fell across the paper in a long, slow yellow bar that had moved by the width of a hand from the beginning of the drawing to the end. He had drawn the cross-section of the chamber. He had drawn the ventilation shaft. He had drawn the trap door. He had labeled every measurement. He had noted every material. He had written in the small margin at the bottom of the paper, in his careful blocky script, the single sentence she would remember afterward more clearly than anything else he had ever said to her. I had written, "You will not need this soon, but there will come a day when you will need it, and on that day there will be no one alive to draw it for you again." He had folded the paper into 4. He had handed it across the table. He had said in Norwegian, "Put it somewhere you will remember." She had said, "I will." She had put the paper in the small canvas satchel she had brought with her from Dakota Territory. She had ridden the train back to Grafton the following week. She had unpacked the satchel in the sod house on a warm evening in the last week of July, and she had unfolded the paper once, and she had looked at it, and she had folded it back into 4 and put it at the bottom of her mother's chest. 3 months later, Osmond Vinje was dead of a stroke in his sleep in his own bed in the small frame house on the outskirts of Wilmar. He was 61 years old. He had, so far as Ilse ever knew, drawn the cross-section on the brown paper only once in his life, only for her, and only on that Tuesday afternoon in July of the year 1880, with the yellow bar of light moving slowly across the kitchen table between them. Ilse Rasmussen sat at her small pine table in her sod house in Dakota Territory on the afternoon of the second week of September 1884, and she read the notes on the brown paper for the first time in 4 years, and the sentence at the bottom of the paper came up off the page and stood in the room in front of her, the way a spoken sentence stands in a room in front of a person who has just heard it. You will not need this soon, but there will come a day when you will need it. She folded the paper carefully back into 4. She placed it inside the front of her dress against her ribs, where it made a small dry rectangle of pressure that she would feel all through the coming weeks whenever she moved. She stood up. She went to the window of the sod house, and she looked out across the yard past the small pole corral where Solve the cow stood, chewing patiently, past the low-mounded roof of the small barn, past the low pale line of the horizon in the north, where the pewter had begun to darken into something that was almost the color of iron. She looked for a long time. She was not looking at the sky. She was looking at the small, crude structure that stood along the north wall of the sod house 12 feet from her doorway, built of rough-cut plank and roofed with tar paper and holding. At that moment, approximately 3.5 cords of cottonwood and green ash that she and her daughters had stacked through the last 3 weeks of August. She was looking at the woodshed. The woodshed had been built by Magnus in the summer of 1882. It was 8 feet wide and 12 feet long, and had a dirt floor and a single-hinged door that faced east. It had no windows. It had, on account of its position along the north wall of the sod house, no direct exposure to any road or track. The nearest wagon trail passed the claim on the south side of the sod house, 320 feet from the small east-facing door of the woodshed, and no traveler on the wagon trail could see the woodshed at all from any point along the trail. The woodshed was in every respect that mattered to Ilse Rasmussen on the afternoon of the second week of September 1884, the most forgettable structure on the claim. That was precisely why she chose it. She understood, standing at the window with the brown paper pressed against her ribs, exactly what she was going to do. She was not going to dig in the open yard where a passing traveler on the wagon trail would see the disturbed earth and remember it. She was not going to dig behind the barn where Solve the cow might wander into the excavation and break a leg. She was not going to dig in the small pasture down by the creek where the water table was high and the walls of the chamber would seep for the whole first winter. She was going to dig directly under the footprint of the existing woodshed. She was going to pull the wood back from the north corner of the shed, one stack at a time, and she was going to dig the 8-foot chamber into the ground beneath the shed, and she was going to cover the ceiling and rebuild the floor of the shed above it, and she was going to stack the wood back where it had been, and no man riding past on the wagon trail 320 feet away would ever look at that structure and see anything at all that had changed about it. She stood at the window for a long time, and she looked at the woodshed. Then she turned back into the room. She went to the pine table. She sat down. She took a small slip of paper from a folded pile she kept on the shelf above the stove for keeping accounts, and she took the stub of a lead pencil, and she began to write in a small, careful hand a list of the things she was going to need. She wrote lumber. She wrote spade. She wrote trenching shovel. She wrote wheelbarrow. She wrote auger. She wrote timber for the ceiling. She wrote straw. She wrote lamp oil. She wrote nails. She wrote leather for the hinges. She wrote at the very bottom of the list in small letters the word silence. She looked at the list for a long time. Then she folded the list into 4 and put it inside the front of her dress next to the brown paper. And she stood up and she went to begin the small preparations that would carry her across the next 3 weeks. She went into Grafton on the following Saturday. She took the small buckboard wagon that Magnus had built in their 4th summer hitched to solve the cow because she had no horse and had never had one. And the trip that a good horse would have made in 3 hours took her most of the day. She left at first light. She reached the edge of Grafton at mid-morning. She tied Solve to the hitching rail outside the dry goods store, and she went inside, and she made her way slowly through the store the way any careful woman does who is buying more than she can easily afford. She bought a spool of black thread. She bought a small paper of sewing needles. She bought 2 pounds of coffee. She bought a small tin of black pepper. She bought at the end of her visit 4 pieces of 2x6 pine lumber, each 8 feet long, on the understanding that she was going to use them to reinforce the sagging floor of her sod house against the coming winter. Prescott, the merchant, wrote the purchase against her account without any question at all. I was a thin man in his 50s with pale hands and a green eyeshade, and he had been extending her credit for the whole 18 months since Magnus had died. And he had never once in that time asked her a question about what she was buying it for or how she intended to use it. Ilse had understood from the first month that this was not kindness on his part. Prescott was a man who let a widow accumulate debt because a widow who accumulated debt was a widow who would eventually have to sign over the claim. He had signed 6 other claims into his own name over the previous 10 years by that same slow patient method, and he had a small locked cabinet in the back of the store where he kept the deeds and the signed papers. Ilse knew this about him. She smiled at him at the counter. She thanked him for his patience. She loaded the lumber into the back of the buckboard, along with the small paper parcels of coffee and thread and needles and pepper, and she drove, Solve slowly back out of town on the road that led east toward her claim. She stopped once on the road about halfway back at the small farm of Rune Kjelstad. Rune was at the door of his own barn when she pulled the buckboard into his yard. He came out to meet her without a word, and he looked at the lumber in the back of the wagon, and he looked at her, and he did not ask what she needed. He waited. Ilse said, "I need to borrow your long auger for a week. The 4-inch one with the T-handle. I have to bore drainage holes through the base of my water trough before the freeze." Rune looked at her. He looked at the lumber in the wagon. He did not connect the 2 things. There was no reason he should have connected them. A widow buying lumber to shore up her floor and needing to bore drainage holes through her water trough were 2 separate ordinary tasks that any homesteader might undertake in the last warm week of September. And Rune Kjelstad was a man who had lived his whole life among ordinary tasks and did not see at that moment any reason to look for a pattern where the pieces did not obviously fit together. He said, "I will get it." I went into the barn. He came out with the long auger in his hand. He set it into the back of the buckboard beside the lumber, and he stood for a moment beside the wagon, and he looked at Ilse, and she could see in his face the memory of the afternoon the previous week when he had come to her yard with his hat in his hands. I did not say anything about that afternoon. He said only, "You bring it back when you are finished." She said, "I will bring it back the day after I'm finished. I thank you, Mr. Kjelstad." She drove Solve out of his yard and back onto the road, and she made the last 4 miles home in the gathering dusk, and she reached the sod house just as the last of the light was going out of the western sky. Solveig was at the door. Solveig had heard the wagon from a long way off. She stood in the doorway with her small arms wrapped around herself against the cold, and she watched her mother drive Solve into the yard, and she came forward when the wagon stopped, and she helped her mother unhitch Solve without being asked. She was 9 years old that autumn. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's careful gray eyes, and she had, in the 18 months since Magnus had died, developed a way of moving through the small daily work of the sod house that was quiet and practical and did not require anyone to give her instructions. Ilse looked at her elder daughter across the back of the cow. She said, Solveig. Solveig said, yes, Mama. Ilse said, there is going to be a great deal of work to do around the yard for the next 3 weeks. I am going to need you to help me with some of it. And I am going to need you to not talk about it to anyone. Not to your sister. Not to Mr. Kjellstad if he comes by. Not to Mrs. Kjellstad. Not to anyone at all. Do you understand what I'm asking you? Solveig looked at her mother across the back of the cow. She did not ask what the work was going to be. She said, yes, Mama, I understand. Ilse nodded. She led Solve into the small corral. She unhitched the buckboard. She lifted the 4 pieces of 2x6 lumber out of the back of the wagon one at a time, and she carried them around the north corner of the sod house, and she stacked them along the outer wall of the woodshed, out of sight of the wagon trail. She lifted the long auger down last. She carried it into the woodshed. She stood inside the woodshed for a moment, with the door pulled almost closed behind her, and the last of the western light coming in through the crack of the door in a narrow bar across the dirt floor. She looked at the wood stacks along the east wall. She looked at the north corner where she was going to begin. She stood in the small, dry-smelling dark, and she felt against her ribs the small folded rectangle of the brown paper her father had drawn for her in the summer of 1880. Then she went back into the sod house. She fed the girls a supper of boiled potatoes and salt pork. She read them a page from the old primer. She put them to bed in the narrow bed at the back of the house, and she pulled the wool blanket up over their shoulders, and she stood in the doorway of the back room for a long moment, looking at the two of them curled together the way they always slept, and she went out into the front room, and she banked the stove for the night. She sat at the small pine table by the last light of a tallow candle. She unfolded the brown paper. She smoothed it flat on the pine wood. She looked at the drawing for a long time. Outside the sod house, the wind out of the north had a note in it, now that was thinner and higher than it had been in the afternoon, and colder and steadier. And old men in that country would have listened to that note, the way sailors listen for a change in the color of the sea. Ilse Rasmussen folded the drawing. She banked the candle. She went to bed. At first light of the following morning in the last week of September, in the year 1884, she went out into the yard with a long-handled spade in her right hand and a short-handled trenching shovel in her left hand, and she walked around the north corner of the sod house to the small east-facing door of the woodshed, and she pulled the door open and she stepped inside. She pulled the first stack of cottonwood away from the north corner. She set the spade against the exposed dirt of the corner. She placed her right boot on the top of the blade. She pushed down. The blade of the spade went into the dirt of the woodshed floor with the small dry sound of iron meeting earth that has not been turned in a long time. Ilse Rasmussen pushed it down on the handle with her whole weight, and the blade went into the depth of her boot, and she rocked the handle back and lifted the first small wedge of dark loam out of the floor and set it aside on a piece of old canvas she had spread against the east wall. She looked at the small hole she had made. She looked at the outline of the chamber she had chalked onto the dirt floor the night before by the light of the tallow candle, a rectangle 10 feet long and 7 feet wide, laid out exactly where the drawing on the brown paper had told her to lay it. She looked at the corner of the rectangle where she had just made her first cut. Then she set the blade back into the earth and she pushed down again. The first day she worked from first light until the sun was directly overhead, and she could hear Elin calling her from the door of the sod house for the midday meal. She had moved perhaps 140 small wedges of loam onto the canvas by then, and she had cleared the top 2 inches of the entire rectangle, and her lower back had begun to give her the small warning ache that would eventually, over the course of the coming 9 days, become a permanent condition she stopped noticing. She stopped at noon and went into the house. She fed the girls a plain meal of bread and cheese and hot chicory. She washed her hands at the small basin by the door. She did not answer when Elin asked her, as Elin had been asking her every day for a week, whether they were going to see the Kjellstad children before winter set in for good. She said only that they would see. She said only that she needed to go back out for the afternoon. She said only to Solveig in a quiet voice that Elin did not hear that she would appreciate it if Solveig would keep Elin occupied inside the house for the rest of the afternoon and would not let her come around to the north side of the sod house on any account. Solveig said, "Yes, Mama." Solveig said it without asking why. Ilse went back out. She worked from noon until the last of the western light was going, and by the time she stopped that evening, she had cleared the top 10 inches of the rectangle, and she had moved the excavated earth in 14 wheelbarrow loads around to the south wall of the sod house, where she banked it carefully in a long, low mound that any observer would have taken for a woman piling earth against her walls to keep the coming cold from seeping into her house through the sod, which in the smallest sense was exactly what she was doing. She went inside. She washed. She ate a supper she did not taste. She read the girls a page from the primer, and she put them to bed, and she stood in the doorway of the back room for a moment longer than usual that night, and she looked at the two of them curled together under the wool blanket, and she thought about the small folded rectangle of brown paper against her ribs, and she thought about the 8 feet she had promised herself she would dig into the dirt of Dakota Territory before the frost came, and she thought about how she was at the end of the first day of the work, not even a foot down. Then she went to bed and she slept. On the second morning, she went back out at first light. On the third morning, she went back out at first light. On the fourth morning, she went back out at first light, and by the middle of the fourth morning, her palms had blistered and broken in 3 places on the right hand and 2 places on the left, and she had wrapped each of the broken places in a strip of clean linen and had gone back to the spade and had continued. By the middle of the fourth morning, she had moved 63 wheelbarrow loads of excavated earth around to the south wall of the house. The mound of banked earth against the south wall had begun to look from a distance like the small earthwork that a homesteader with more energy than sense might have built along his own foundation in a very productive week. Hedda Kjelstad, who had ridden past the claim in a light spring wagon on the third afternoon on her way back from the Solberg place, had looked at the banked earth from the wagon trail and had thought only that Ilse Rasmussen was preparing for winter with more care than most widows managed. She had not looked at the woodshed at all. The woodshed from the wagon trail was invisible. It was on that fourth morning that Solveig came out of the sod house without being asked with a small tin bucket in her hand and walked around the north corner of the house and pulled open the small east-facing door of the woodshed and stepped inside. Ilse was at the bottom of the excavation, which by that morning was down about 3.5 feet, and she was working with the short-handled trenching shovel because the long spade had become too awkward in the confined space. She heard the small sound of the door coming open behind her. She heard the small, quick breath Solveig took when she saw what was in the floor of the woodshed. She turned around. Solveig was standing just inside the door with the tin bucket in her hand. She was looking at the rectangular pit in the floor of the woodshed, and she was looking at her mother standing 3.5 feet below the level of the floor in the middle of the pit, and she was looking at the pile of loose earth in the wheelbarrow beside the pit that Ilse had been about to run out around the corner to the banking pile. She did not speak. Ilse did not speak either at first. The two of them looked at each other across the space of the woodshed for a long moment, and Ilse understood in the small stopped hush of that moment that everything about the next 3 years was going to be decided in whatever she said in the next 30 seconds. She could send Solveig back to the house. She could tell her the truth. She could tell her a version of the truth. She could tell her a lie so complete that Solveig would remember the lie for the rest of her life. Each of the paths was possible. She looked at her daughter. She looked at the small tin bucket in her daughter's hand. She said quietly, "You are going to help me." Solveig said, "Yes, Mama." Ilse said, "You are not going to ask me what it is for." Solveig said, "No, Mama." Ilse said, "You are not going to tell Elin. You are not going to tell Mr. or Mrs. Kjelstad. You are not going to tell anyone at all, not now, not this winter, not next summer. Do you understand what I am telling you?" Solveig said, "Yes, Mama." Ilse said, "Not even years from now, Solveig. Not even to your own children if you have them. This is a thing we keep, you and I, until I tell you it is no longer a thing that needs keeping. Do you understand?" Solveig looked at her mother. She was 9 years old. She was standing in the small, dry dark of a woodshed with a tin bucket in her hand, and her mother was 3.5 feet below the level of the floor with a shovel in her hand and a smear of red dirt across the side of her jaw, and the wind outside was pulling at the tar paper of the roof with a note in it that had not been there the previous week. She said, "Yes, Mama, I understand." She came forward. She set down the tin bucket. She picked up the small wooden scoop that Ilse had been using to fill the wheelbarrow, and she climbed carefully down into the excavation, and she began to scoop the loose earth into the wheelbarrow. one small quantity at a time, working with the slow, patient attention of a child who has just been trusted with something adult. Ilse watched her for a moment. Then she picked up the trenching shovel and she went back to work. The two of them worked in the woodshed for the rest of that morning, and for the rest of that afternoon, and for the rest of the days that followed, in a silence that was not the silence of two people who had nothing to say to each other, but the silence of two people who had understood, without needing to speak it, that certain kinds of work are made lighter, not by conversation, but by the presence of another pair of hands moving through the same air. Elin in the sod house played with her rag doll and did not come around the north corner. Ilse reached the required depth of 8 feet on the ninth morning. She had moved in total approximately 4.5 tons of earth. Her hands had blistered and broken and healed and blistered again, and had begun in the last 2 days to develop a thick, pale rind of new skin across the palms that would remain there for the rest of her life. Her lower back gave her a low, steady ache that she felt in her teeth when she turned over in her sleep. She was not complaining. She was at the bottom of the chamber on the morning of the 9th day doing arithmetic. The chamber was 8 feet deep, 10 feet long, 7 feet wide. The walls were vertical and clean. The floor was tamped bare earth exactly as the drawing had specified. She climbed out of the chamber on a small ladder she had built from 2 lengths of scrap plank and 4 rungs, and she stood at the edge of the excavation in the dry, cool air of the woodshed. And she looked down at what she had made, and she allowed herself for the space of about 10 seconds to feel a small, clean thing in the middle of her chest that she had not felt in the 18 months since Magnus had died. Then she went to work on the timber. She cut 7 cottonwood poles from the deadfall stand along the small creek that ran through the Shellstad claim to the east. Each pole was roughly 8 feet long and between 5 and 7 inches in diameter. And Rune had told her in the spring that she was welcome to cut deadfall from that stand, as he had no immediate use for it, and she cut the 7 poles on a cold morning in the 2nd week of October, when a hard frost had made the creek bottom firm enough to work on. She hauled them back on the buckboard, 2 poles per trip, with Solve pulling patiently in her traces because Solve was a good milk cow who had, in the absence of a horse on the claim, learned in the 18 months since Magnus had died to pull a light wagon without complaint. 4 trips, 2 days. She laid the 7 poles across the width of the chamber on the afternoon of the 2nd day. She set each pole into a notch she had cut into the subsoil walls with the trenching shovel so that the full round surface of the pole rested against the earth and could not shift or roll. She packed the small gaps between the poles with strips of old burlap sacking that she had first soaked in water and then allowed to freeze solid in the yard overnight, a technique her father had called frost mortar, which would hold through the winter and could be cleared away in the spring without damaging the timbers. Over the poles she laid straw. She had cut the straw herself in the low ground near the creek in the last warm week of September, and she had dried it in the small barn, and she had brought it to the woodshed in wheelbarrow loads, and she spread it now across the full ceiling surface of the chamber in an even layer to a depth of 14 inches. Over the straw she began to replace the excavated earth, tamping each layer with the flat back of the spade and the heel of her boot until the whole ceiling was covered to a depth of another 18 inches. When she was finished, the surface of the woodshed floor above the chamber was elevated by about 8 inches over what it had been. The elevation was barely noticeable. It could be easily explained by settling and by the general accumulation of debris that occurs in any woodshed over a season of use. She spread a scatter of wood chips over the disturbed area, and she restacked the cottonwood and green ash on top of it, arranging the stacks exactly as they had been in the 1st week of September. And when she had finished restacking the wood, no man riding past on the wagon trail 320 feet away would have been able to look at the woodshed and see any evidence at all that the floor of it had been disturbed since Magnus had built the shed 2 summers before. She framed the trap door on the 17th of October. The frame was 2x6 pine lumber cut from the 4 boards she had bought at Prescott's store in the last week of September. The door itself was cut from the same lumber, 2 pieces face nailed together for thickness, with a recessed pull ring made from a bent nail and a short length of harness leather. She fitted the frame carefully into the opening in the ceiling of the chamber, and she hung the door on hinges she had cut from a strip of thick oiled leather she had saved from an old bridle, and she covered the top of the door, when closed, with a thin layer of loose dirt and a scattering of wood chips indistinguishable from the shed floor around it. She tested it 6 times. She had Solveig walk across the woodshed floor twice without being told where the door was, and both times Solveig walked over the door without noticing anything. the ventilation shaft she bored on the 19th of October. She used the long auger she had borrowed from Rune Kjelstad in the last week of September, and she bored the shaft at 45 degrees through the north wall of the woodshed at the height and angle her father's drawing had specified. The shaft emerged outside at a point 6 inches above the ground on the outer face of the north wall, angled so that its opening faced slightly downward and was partly shielded from direct wind impact by the base of the shed itself. She tested the draw of the shaft with a lit tallow candle held at the base of it inside the chamber, and the flame bent steadily inward toward the shaft, which told her the Venturi principle her father had explained to her. At the kitchen table in Wilmar was working exactly as he had said it would. She returned the auger to Rune Kjelstad on the 20th. She thanked him. She did not say what she had bored with it, beyond repeating the story about the drainage holes in the water trough, which she had in fact bored in her own trough on the previous afternoon so that she could show him the fresh holes if he had wished to see them. I had not wished to see them. He had taken the auger back and set it inside his own barn without comment, and asked her instead how the girls were faring and whether her stovepipe was in good order for the coming winter. She had answered him. She had ridden Solve home. She had reached the sod house at dusk. She had that evening standing in the small quiet dark of the woodshed with the trap door closed at her feet and the wood stacks put back exactly as they had been finished, the thing her father had drawn for her in ink on brown paper 4 years and 3 months before. The first winter came on within a week. It was not a hard winter as those things were reckoned in Pembina County. The temperature dropped hard in the first week of November and stayed low through the middle of December, and there were 2 storms of moderate intensity during that period. But neither of the storms carried the killing cold that men in that country came to fear in later years, and Ilse used the chamber only twice during the whole of that first winter. The first time was in the last week of December, when a 3-day storm drove the temperature to 28 below zero, and the sod house became genuinely dangerous. She moved the girls and the essential supplies down through the trapdoor, without ceremony and without explanation beyond telling Solvig and Elin that this was what their grandfather had taught her to do, and that it was safe, and that they were going to be perfectly warm. Solvig, who was 9, and who had already worked beside her mother in the dark of the woodshed for 6 days, accepted the descent through the trapdoor without a word. Elin, who was 7 and who had not been told any of what her sister knew, cried for perhaps 40 minutes on the first night she ever spent underground. She cried in the small hiccuping way she cried when she was frightened and did not want to be frightened, and she cried until Ilse pulled her into her lap on the wool blanket spread across the tamped earth floor of the chamber, and Ilse held her, and Ilse rocked her, and Ilse hummed to her the small old lullaby that Osmond had hummed to Ilse in another kitchen a long time before in a country neither of them had ever seen. Elin fell asleep in her mother's lap. She slept for 11 hours on the warm earth floor. She woke in the morning without any memory at all of having been afraid the night before, and she asked her mother for breakfast, and she ate it with a good appetite. And when the storm broke on the following afternoon, and Ilse climbed up through the trap door and out into the woodshed, and out into the yard, Elin followed her up the ladder without any protest at all, and did not for the rest of that winter speak of the chamber to anyone. The second time Ilse used the chamber that first winter was in the 3rd week of January, when she came down with a bad chest cold that she could not shake in the drafty back room of the sod house. She moved herself and the girls down for 4 days, and she slept, and she recovered, and she came up again on the 5th morning with her lungs clear and her fever gone. In neither case did any of the neighbors know. In neither case did any tracks in the snow between the sod house and the woodshed suggest that anything unusual had happened, because Ilse crossed the 12 feet of open ground between the 2 structures at times when the wind was covering her tracks within the hour, and because a woman crossing between her house and her woodshed in a snowstorm was not a thing that any observer would have found unusual in the first place. By the spring of 1885, Ilse Rasmussen was the only homesteader within a 6-mile radius of her claim who had not lost at least one animal to the cold. The Kjelstad family had lost 2 pigs and a calf. A Norwegian bachelor named Vidar Sandvik, who held the claim 3 miles to the northwest, had lost 7 of his 8 sheep when a sudden temperature drop in the 2nd week of February had caught him without sufficient bedding straw, and his barn roof had partly collapsed under the snow load. A newer family named Almqvist, who had arrived from Wisconsin the previous spring and had built a small frame house with walls only 4 inches thick, had spent the last 6 weeks of winter living with the Kjelstads after their stove had cracked, and they had burned through their remaining firewood trying to compensate. None of them knew about the chamber under Ilse's woodshed. None of them thought to ask her how she had managed so well. What they thought instead, and this was the thing that people decide about a widow when they cannot explain her competence, was that she had been lucky. The winter had not been so bad, really. She had managed. It was good that she had managed. The general sense in the small scattered community of Pembina County by the middle of April 1885 was that this had been a special circumstance and that the next winter or the winter after would demonstrate that a woman alone on 47 acres was not a sustainable arrangement. They were kind about it. That almost made it worse. Hedda Kjellstad said as much to Ilse one afternoon in the third week of April at the small stone-lined well that stood midway between the two claims on the section line, where the two women had come at the same time to fill their buckets. Hedda was a small woman, thin and quick in her movements, with hair the color of dry prairie grass and eyes that were the pale washed blue of a piece of glass that has been lying in the sun for a long time. She had been Ilse's closest neighbor for 6 years. She had brought a covered dish to the sod house on the day after Magnus was buried. She was a kind woman. She said over the low stone lip of the well, "You were lucky this year." Ilse said yes. Hedda said the winter was not so bad, really. It could have been worse. My man says it could have been much worse. You managed. Ilse said, I managed. Hedda said, it is good that you managed, but you must think about the next one, Ilse. My man is still thinking about the offer he made to you in September. The offer stands, the cousin in Fargo, the boarding house. It is not a bad way to spend a winter for a woman with 2 small children. Ilse looked at Hedda across the low stone lip of the well. She looked at the kind, pale-washed eyes. She looked at the small, quick hands filling the wooden bucket. She looked at the woman who had sat with her in the front room of the sod house for 2 hours on the third day after Magnus was buried and had said nothing at all and had been exactly what Ilse had needed. And she felt in that moment, standing at the well in the small, warm sunlight of a Dakota April afternoon, the exact thin, cold weight of what her father had told her at the kitchen table in Wilmar 4 years and 9 months before. You will not need this soon, but there will come a day when you will need it. She said, thank you, Hedda. I will think about it. She said it in the tone of a woman who intended to think about no such thing. Hedda heard the tone. Hedda smiled at her, the small measured smile of a neighbor who has done her duty and has been rebuffed, and Hedda picked up her filled bucket and turned and walked back along the section line toward the Kjellstad claim. And Ilse Rasmussen stood alone at the well for a long moment, with her own bucket in her hand and the sun on the back of her neck. The summer of 1885 she used to expand. She dug over the course of 6 weeks in June and July, a secondary alcove off the eastern wall of the main chamber 4 feet wide, 6 feet long, connected to the main space by a low arched opening that required an adult to duck slightly to pass through. The alcove she fitted as a small stable annex with a low wooden manger built against its far wall and the floor covered in a 6-inch layer of clean sand over the bare earth. She had read in the notes at the bottom of her father's drawing that the original builders of these structures in the old country had routinely integrated small livestock into the shelter during extreme cold, the animals providing additional body heat that could raise the chamber temperature by as much as 15 degrees. Solve the cow was too large. The 3 hens were not. She built a small hinged crate for them that could be lowered through a second smaller trapdoor she cut into the floor of the woodshed directly above the alcove opening. She added in the last 2 weeks of August a feature her father had described in the notes on the paper but which she had not built in the initial construction. He had called it in his own words in varmesvinghjul, which translated roughly as a thermal flywheel, though the term was entirely his own and not found in any book that Ilse had ever read. Along the western wall of the main chamber, she stacked over the course of 3 separate wagon trips to the creek bed on the Kjellstad claim 47 river stones. Each stone weighed between 8 and 20 pounds. She arranged them in an interlocking pattern against the wall, building a stack roughly 4 feet high and 3 feet deep that left about 2 feet of working space between the stone mass and the center of the chamber. Her father had understood something that most men of his time had not thought to articulate. Stone, particularly the dense sedimentary stone of a riverbed, absorbs heat slowly and releases it even more slowly. A mass of stone maintained at ground temperature for months will continue to radiate that stored thermal energy for hours after the air temperature around it has dropped. In practical terms, this meant that if Ilse heated the chamber with an oil lantern for 2 or 3 hours before retreating to it in an emergency, the stone wall would hold and release that warmth for the following 12 to 18 hours with no additional fuel required at all. She tested this on a cold October morning in 1885. She heated the chamber for 2 hours with the lantern. She extinguished the lantern. She sealed the trap door. She went back to the house and continued her day. 12 hours later, she opened the trap door. The thermometer at chest height in the middle of the chamber read 51 degrees. Outside, it was 14 above zero and dropping. She closed the trap door. She went back to the house and started supper. There was one afternoon in the middle of August of that year when Ilse Rasmussen, on her third trip back from the creek bed with a wagon load of river stones, sat down on the low bank of the creek with the wagon halted behind her and the sun coming down on the water in a wide flat sheet of white light. And she looked at the water for a long time without moving. She had loaded 22 stones that morning. Her back hurt. Her hands were raw. She had spent the previous 3 summers of her life in the same 6-week pattern of digging, hauling, cutting, stacking, testing, and covering. And she had done it in complete silence, and she had done it alone, but for the small silent help of a 9-year-old girl who was now 10, and she had done it on the strength of an ink drawing on a folded piece of brown paper that her dead father had given her on a Tuesday afternoon in Minnesota 5 years before. She looked at the water on the creek. She asked herself, sitting there on the bank, in the small sound of the water moving over the pale flat stones, whether she was building a monument to her father's cleverness, or whether she was building the small stubborn shelter that she had told herself she was building, and she found sitting there that she did not entirely know the answer. She heard a small step on the grass behind her. She turned her head. Solveig had walked down from the wagon and was standing perhaps 6 feet behind her mother in a plain gray cotton dress with a smear of Red Creek clay across the hem. And Solveig did not say anything because Solveig at 10 years old had already understood that certain moments required a daughter to stand near her mother without speaking. Solveig walked forward. She sat down on the bank beside Ilse. She did not put her head against her mother's shoulder because she was 10 and had begun to hold her body separate in the way a girl of 10 will hold her body separate. She sat beside her mother instead, in the way 2 grown women sit together on a piece of ground when there is something between them that does not need saying, and the 2 of them looked at the water for a long time. Ilse stood up eventually. She said, "There are 25 more stones to bring up." Solveig stood up. She said, "I will carry the small ones." The 2 of them walked back to the wagon together, and Ilse Rasmussen picked up a river stone that weighed perhaps 16 pounds, and she carried it up the low bank to the buckboard, and she laid it in the bed of the wagon with the others, and she did not sit down again by the creek for the rest of that summer, and she did not ask herself the question again. The autumn of 1886 came on with signs. She noticed them one at a time through the last 3 weeks of September and the first 2 weeks of October. She noticed that the ground squirrels along the creek bank had begun to cache seed more aggressively than she remembered from any previous fall on the claim. She noticed that a family of muskrats she had watched for several summers in a slow-water bend of the creek had built their lodge that year. Not to the usual height of 18 inches above the waterline, but to a height of nearly 3 feet, with walls thickened to almost twice their usual dimension. She noticed that the small flocks of early migrating songbirds that ordinarily passed through the country in the middle of October had already gone by the 28th of September, and that certain of the later flocks had not stopped at all and had passed overhead in the middle of the day without descending to feed. She did not know why she noticed these things. She knew only that her father, in the small margin of the paper he had drawn for her, had written a single sentence about the reading of animals in the autumn of a bad year. He had written, "The small ones know first, and they do not know how to say it, and a person who has learned to watch them will know a month before the men in the town." She began in the second week of October to make quiet, deliberate preparations. She moved an additional 30 pounds of dried provisions into the chamber cornmeal and dried beans and a small crock of pickled cabbage that she had put up in September. She refilled the lamp oil tin in the chamber to its full capacity of 2 gallons. She brought in a 4th flat river stone that she had held out from the earlier, hauling a piece of dark shale about the length of her forearm, and she wedged it into the top tier of the thermal wall along the western side of the chamber, where it filled the last small gap in the stacked mass and completed the arrangement. She re-examined every joint in the ceiling timbers by the light of the brass lantern, and she found 2 small sections of the frost mortar that had cracked over the previous summer, and she replaced them with fresh packed clay from the small pit behind the barn. She moved the hen's laying crate into the alcove permanently on the last day of October and covered the smaller trapdoor in the woodshed floor above the alcove with a fresh scatter of wood chips. On the 6th of November, on a walk out along the section line to check the fence, She noticed that the ground beneath her boots had gone hard in the night for the first time that year. The freeze was in. It was 3 weeks earlier than the freeze had come in the year before. She stood at the fence for a moment and looked north. The sky in the north was the color of a piece of iron that had been left out in the rain for a long time. She turned and walked back to the sod house. She did not tell Solveig or Elin what she had seen. She did not tell Rune or Hedda Kjelstad. She did not tell Vidar Sandvik or the Almqvists or the small family of Roskildis who had come out from Iowa the previous spring and had built a dugout in the low ground half a mile south of her claim. She told no one at all in the whole scattered community of Pembina County that the winter of 1886, in her considered reading of the small ones who knew first, was going to be the winter that the country decided once and for all who among them had been paying attention and who among them had not. She went back to the sod house. She fed the girls a supper of hot beans and cornbread. She read them a page from the primer. She put them to bed in the narrow bed at the back of the house, and she pulled the wool blanket up over their shoulders, and she stood in the doorway of the back room for a long moment looking at the two of them. And she thought about the small brown paper folded against her ribs, and she thought about the 8 feet of chamber under the woodshed, and she thought about the 47 river stones stacked against the western wall of it, and she thought about the 2 gallons of lamp oil in the tin on the shelf, and she thought about the small, hard, cold ground she had walked on that afternoon along the fence line, and she felt for the first time in 3 years a small thing in the middle of her chest that was not fear. It was not fear, and it was not pride, and it was not vindication. It was something quieter than any of those. It was the small, clean feeling of a person who has done in silence and alone the exact work that needed to be done, and who is now standing at the door of the room in which the 2 people she loves most in the world are sleeping, and who knows without needing to say it aloud to anyone that whatever the country is about to send at them, she has already answered it. She banked the stove. She went to bed. Outside the sod house, the wind out of the north had begun to lay itself down along the ground in long, slow lines that would still be there in the morning, and the small sound of it against the sod walls was the sound of something patient that had been waiting a long time for its hour. The first storm came on the 17th of November. It was not the storm that would kill men in Pembina County that winter. It was the storm that came ahead of the storm that would kill men, the way the low, thin note of a bell in the far distance comes ahead of the sustained note of the bell, struck in the room, and Ilse Rasmussen heard it for what it was on the second morning of it, when the temperature outside the sod house had held at 15 below zero for 18 hours without moving upward by a single degree. She kept herself and the girls in the sod house. She fed the stove carefully. She counted the wood. She banked the small heat against the coldest hours of the night by piling the wool blankets over both the girls' bed and her own bed, and by hanging her spare wool coat across the small south-facing window to break the draft that came in around the frame. The storm went on for 3 days. The wind held out of the northwest at 25 miles an hour with gusts to 35. The temperature at its worst on the second night reached 22 below zero. The chamber under the woodshed she did not use. She did not use it because she did not, that time, need it. The sod house held. The stove held. The girls slept warm under the piled blankets. She kept the door of the woodshed closed and the trapdoor sealed with its scatter of wood chips undisturbed. And on the morning of the 4th day, when the wind laid down and the sun came out weak and pale over a country that was now covered to a depth of 11 inches. In packed snow, she went out into the yard and she looked at the north horizon, and she understood standing there in the small hard light of that 4th morning that the storm that had just gone by had been the warning. The storm itself was still coming. It came on the 9th of January. She felt the change in the air 3 days before it arrived. The temperature, which had settled at a middling 5 above zero in the last week of December, and had held there through the first days of the new year, began on the 6th of January to drop steadily by 2 or 3 degrees at a time. By the morning of the 9th, it was 20 below. By noon of the 9th, it was 28 below. By the middle of the afternoon of the 9th, the wind out of the northwest began to rise from the low, steady note. It had been holding for 2 days into the full sustained note of a large weight of air, moving southward across an enormous distance of open country, and the small, hard flakes of what would become a great deal of snow began to sift down out of a sky that had gone the color of iron struck cold on an anvil. Ilse was at the small pine table in the front room of the sod house. She had been mending the sleeve of one of Elin's winter dresses. She stopped with the needle in her hand. She listened. She heard the note in the wind. She set the needle carefully into the folded fabric. She stood up. She said Solveig. Solveig, who was 11 years old that winter, and who had grown 2 full inches over the previous summer, and who had begun to move through the small daily work of the sod house, with the practical economy of a woman rather than a child, looked up from the slate she was working at by the stove. Ilse said, "It is time." Solveig set down her chalk. She did not ask what her mother meant. She went to the back room and she took Elin by the hand, and she said to Elin in the low, steady voice she had learned from her mother, that they were going to spend the next few days in the room under the woodshed, the way they had done that time before, and that Elin was to put on her heaviest wool. Now both of her wool stockings, both of her wool skirts, her wool jerkin, her mittens, and her scarf, and that she was to do it quickly and without asking questions. Elin, who was 9 and who had spent 5 nights in her whole life under the woodshed, and who did not, on any conscious level, remember. Most of them looked at her sister for a moment. Then she said yes. She began to dress. Ilse worked fast in the front room. She filled a small canvas sack with the last of the fresh bread she had baked the previous morning, a wedge of hard cheese wrapped in cheesecloth, a small crock of soft butter, and a folded bundle of dried apples. She filled a second sack with a fresh bar of yellow soap, a clean linen towel, and a small tin of matches. She filled the iron kettle with water from the covered bucket by the stove, and she carried the kettle out through the front door and around the north corner of the sod house to the woodshed, and she set the kettle down beside the closed trap door, and she went back for the sacks. The wind by then had risen past the point where a person could speak into it and be heard from 10 feet away. She made 3 trips. On the 4th trip, she carried Elin across the 12 feet of open ground between the front door of the sod house and the small east-facing door of the woodshed, with Elin's small face pressed into the collar of her coat and Elin's arms wrapped around her neck, and Solveig walked beside her, holding to the hem of her mother's coat with one small mittened hand and to the rope that Ilse had tied between the 2 doors an hour before with the other. They reached the woodshed. Ilse pulled the door closed behind them. The wind cut off. It did not cut off entirely because the woodshed was a plank structure and not a stone one, but it cut off enough that she could hear her own breathing, and the small, quick breathing of the 2 girls, and the small pattering sound of the fine, hard snow against the outside face of the door. She lifted the trap door. She lowered Elin first down the ladder into the yellow, steady light of the brass lantern she had set burning in the chamber an hour before. She lowered the 2 sacks. She lowered Solveig. She lowered herself last, pulling the trapdoor closed above her as she went down the ladder, and she seated the wooden locking bar across the underside of the trapdoor with the flat of her hand. The 3 of them stood at the bottom of the ladder. The chamber was warm. It was warm in the way a room in a house is warm on a cold morning when the stove has been burning steadily since before dawn. The thermometer she had hung on the western wall at chest height in the 2nd summer of the chamber's existence read 57 degrees. Outside, the temperature had passed 30 below and was still falling. Elin, who had not been in the chamber in over 2 years, and who had no clear memory of the 2 nights she had spent in it, as a 7-year-old looked around slowly. She said, "Mama." Ilse said, "Yes, love." Elin said, "Grandpa made this." Ilse looked at her younger daughter. She said, "Grandpa drew it. Mama made it." Elin considered this. She said, "With Solveig." Ilse looked at Solveig. Solveig looked back at her mother across the yellow light of the lantern, and there passed between them in that small, quiet moment at the bottom of the ladder the acknowledgement of the 9 days in the woodshed, in the autumn of 1884, and the 2 years and 3 months of silence that had followed, and Ilse said quietly, with Solveig, "Yes." She set the sacks on the shelf. She unrolled the wool blankets from where they were stacked in the oiled canvas. She spread one blanket along the base of the western wall where the thermal flywheel would warm the sleepers through the night. She spread a second blanket for the girls to sit on. She checked the ventilation shaft at the base of the eastern wall by holding a lit match at the mouth of it. The flame bent inward, steady and quick. The shaft was drawing. She sat down on the blanket beside Elin. She put her arm around Elin. Elin leaned into her mother's side and did not speak. Solveig sat down on the other side of Ilse and took up the small clay bowl of dried apples her mother had brought down from the shelf and began quietly to portion them out. Outside and above them, on the surface of Dakota Territory, the storm that would enter the memory of that country as simply the hard winter began on the afternoon of the 9th of January, in the year 1887, to lay itself down across the northern plains with the full weight of everything it had brought with it out of the north. The storm held for the rest of that day and through the night, and through all of the following day, and through the second night, and into the third day, without a meaningful pause. The temperature at the station in Grafton was measured on the second morning of the storm at 38 degrees below zero. The wind was measured by the station agent at 47 miles an hour. Cottonwood trees along the creek beds cracked open in the night with the sound of pistol shots. A man who had left the shelter of the Solberg place on the second afternoon to try to reach his own claim 2 miles south was found on the road 4 days later, frozen solid in a curled position at the base of a snowdrift, still holding the empty leather traces of the mare that had bolted from him in the wind. Under the woodshed, Ilse Rasmussen did what she had planned in silence for 6 years to do. She lit the lantern for 2 hours at a time, then extinguished it for 4. She fed the girls one small hot meal a day. Cornmeal boiled with a little butter warmed over a small tin dish of alcohol she had brought down for the purpose. She read to them by the light of the lantern from the old primer 1 page at a time, the same pages she had read to them 100 times in the sod house. And Elin listened without speaking, and Solveig turned the pages when her mother asked her to. The chamber held. The thermometer at chest height read 52 on the morning of the second day. It read 49 on the morning of the third day before the 2 hours of lantern heat had been applied. After the lantern, it read 56. The three of them slept wrapped in the wool blankets along the base of the thermal wall. They ate. They waited. On the morning of the third day, in the last hour before Ilse would ordinarily have lit the lantern for its morning warming, Solveig stood up from her place along the wall and walked slowly across the tamped clay floor to the eastern side of the chamber and stood in front of the mouth of the ventilation shaft. She looked at the shaft for a moment. Then she said, "Mama." Ilse looked up. Solveig said, "The candle is not moving." Ilse stood up. She went to the ventilation shaft. She struck a fresh match. She held the flame in the palm of her cupped hand at the mouth of the shaft. The flame did not bend. The flame stood straight up in the still air of the chamber, as if the shaft that opened into it had been simply a hollow closed at both ends. And Ilse understood with the small, clean, cold understanding that had come to her once before on a November afternoon along the section line, when she had felt the ground gone hard 3 weeks early under her boots, that the shaft had gone shut in the night. It had gone shut under the weight of packed, drifted snow above the north wall of the woodshed. The venturi draw that had been running steady across the outer mouth of the shaft for 2 days had been overcome at some point in the last few hours by the sheer weight of the accumulated snow above it, and the shaft was blocked, and the lantern that she was about to light was going to consume over the next 2 hours more of the air in the chamber than the second shaft in the alcove could replace. And by the time the lantern went out, the three of them would be sitting inside a space with air in it that was no longer sufficient to keep 3 human beings alive through the following night. She did not tell Solveig any of this. She said, "Get the broom handle from the corner, the one leaning against the ladder." Solveig got the broom handle. Ilse took the broom handle in her right hand, and she climbed the ladder to the trapdoor. She unseated the locking bar. She pushed the trapdoor open perhaps 6 inches. Cold air poured down through the gap onto the top of her head and along her shoulders in a hard, tight sheet, and she braced her boots against the ladder rungs, and she pushed the trapdoor up another foot, and she rolled her body up through the gap into the small, dry dark of the woodshed. The woodshed was full of blown snow. The fine, hard snow of the storm had been driven under the east-facing door and along the floor and up between the wood stacks for 2 full days. And there were drifts inside the woodshed, now small, hard drifts against the north wall, and one of those drifts had piled itself against the base of the north wall, exactly where the ventilation shaft came out. She did not go to the outside opening of the shaft. She could not in that wind have opened the outer door of the woodshed and walked around the north corner in one piece. She went instead to the inside mouth of the shaft, where it opened into the north wall of the woodshed at knee height. She knelt in front of the mouth of the shaft. She fitted the broom handle into the mouth of the shaft. She pushed the broom handle up along the length of the shaft at 45 degrees, using her shoulder to drive the wood, and she felt at the top of the shaft the compacted resistance of packed snow. She pushed harder. The broom handle went into the packed snow perhaps 2 inches. She pulled the broom handle back. She pushed it forward again. She pulled it back. She did this 7 times before she felt on the 8th push the small, sudden release of the broom handle, breaking through the outer surface of the drift into the open air on the far side of it. Cold air rushed into the shaft. The mouth of the shaft at knee height went in the space of 2 seconds from a still cold hole in the wall to a moving cold source, and she could hear the sudden thin whistling of the outside wind entering the top of the shaft and running down through it and out into the woodshed around her wrist and past her sleeve. She pulled the broom handle out. She went back down through the trapdoor. She sealed the trapdoor above her. She climbed down the ladder into the chamber. She struck a fresh match at the mouth of the shaft at the base of the eastern wall. The flame bent inward steady and quick. The chamber was drawing again. Ilse Rasmussen sat down on the blanket beside her daughters. She let her hands shake for exactly one breath. Then she stopped. She lit the lantern. She hung it from the bent nail in one of the ceiling timbers, and the yellow steady light of the flame moved outward through the chamber and found, as it had found on every morning of the last 2 days, the pale, patient face of Elin against her mother's shoulder and the older, watching face of Solveig on the far side. Solveig said, "Mama." Ilse said, "Yes." Solveig said, "You knew what to do." Ilse said, "My father knew what to do. He told me. I remembered." Solveig looked at her mother for a long moment. Then she said, "When I have a daughter, I will tell her." Ilse Rasmussen did not answer for a moment. She sat on the wool blanket in the yellow lantern light, with her arm around Elin and her other daughter beside her, and the small, clean, steady sound of the ventilation shaft drawing cold air down into the chamber, and she looked at Solveig and she thought about her father at the kitchen table in Wilmar in the summer of 1880, with the yellow bar of afternoon light moving across the folded brown paper between them, and she said quietly, "Yes, love. When you have a daughter, you will tell her." At noon on the 4th day of the storm, the wind laid down for the first time in 90 hours. Ilse waited another 6 hours to be sure. She opened the trap door at the end of the 6th hour. She climbed up into the woodshed. She pushed the outer door open against the packed snow that had drifted against it, and she stepped out into a country that was white and quiet and lit by a low, pale sun, and she saw for the first time what the storm had done. The sod house was drifted to the eaves along the north wall. The small barn was half buried. The cow whom Ilse had brought inside the sod house on the morning of the 9th of January and had led into the back room and had tied to the leg of the wooden bed frame would be alive when Ilse went back into the house, because a cow inside a sod house through a 3-day storm was a cow that had breathed enough warm air onto the walls of the room to hold the temperature above freezing. The yard between the sod house and the woodshed was a single unbroken expanse of packed snow. There were no tracks in it. There would be no tracks in it until Ilse made them. She went back down into the chamber. She brought the girls up. She led them across the yard, breaking a fresh path with her boots. She got them into the sod house. She lit the stove. She began the small, careful work of coming back to the surface. She did not, on that afternoon, know what had happened to any of her neighbors. She would learn it in the days that followed. She would learn it from Rune Kjelstad, who came across the section line on foot on the second afternoon after the storm broke, walking the 1.5 miles between his claim and hers in the packed snow with a horse blanket tied over his coat and rags wrapped around his boots. He arrived at her yard at the middle of the afternoon. He knocked on her door. She opened it. He was thinner in the face than he had been in the autumn. His broad shoulders were narrower under his coat. I looked at her for a moment. Then he said in the specific, brief voice of a man who has just used most of his reserves, "I need help." She said, "Come in and get warm, then go back and bring your wife and your children." I came in. He sat by her stove. He drank the hot chicory she poured for him without speaking for perhaps 10 minutes. His hands, when he set the tin cup down on her table, were shaking. He said, "The north wall of my woodshed came down in the storm. On the night of the 10th, I lost most of my wood. My family and I have been in one room of the house for 3 days on what little cordwood I could dig out. I have perhaps 6 hours of fuel left. My wife has told me I am to bring the family here or we will not survive another night." I did not say I was wrong. I did not say you should not have stayed. He said only what a man says when he has come to another person's door with nothing left in the pack but the plain fact of what he needs. Ilse said, "Bring them, all of them. Bring them by dark." I looked at her. "I," said Mrs. Rasmussen. She said, "Mr. Kjelstad, go and bring them. We will speak of the rest later." He stood up. I went out the door. He walked the 1.5 miles back to his own claim in the low sun of the middle afternoon, and he came back 4 hours later with his wife Hedda and their 4 children, all of them wrapped in every layer they owned, walking single file along the trail. He had already broken that morning, and Ilse Rasmussen was waiting for them at the door of the sod house, with the trap door to the chamber already open and the brass lantern already burning at the bottom of the ladder. Hedda Kjelstad was the last of the family to come through the door of the sod house. She was carrying the youngest of the children, a boy of 2, on her hip. She was very cold. Her lips were the color of the inside of an oyster shell. She had not spoken, Rune would tell Ilse later in the last 2 miles of the walk. Ilse took the small boy from her hip. She walked Hedda through the front room, past the small pine table into the back room, and out through the small door in the north wall that led to the woodshed passageway Magnus had built in the second summer of the sod house, to allow for wood to be brought inside during storms without opening the outer door. She walked her through the passageway. She walked her into the woodshed. She walked her to the open trapdoor. Hedda looked down through the trapdoor into the yellow steady lantern light of the chamber. She looked at the tamped clay floor. She looked at the wall of stacked river stones along the western side. She looked at the low arched opening that led to the alcove where 3 hens now sat quietly in their crate in the sand. She looked at the ventilation shaft at the base of the eastern wall. She looked at all of it for a long moment. Then she turned her head and she looked at Ilse Rasmussen, who was standing beside her with the small boy still on her hip. And she said the only question that made sense. She said, "How long have you had this?" Ilse said, "Since October of 1884. Hedda Kjellstad looked at her for a long moment. She did not speak. She turned back to the trapdoor. She climbed down the ladder into the chamber. She reached up to take her small son from Ilse, and Ilse handed the boy carefully down through the trapdoor, and Hedda took him, and she carried him to the wool blanket along the base of the thermal wall, and she sat down with him against her chest, and she began quietly to cry. She cried for perhaps 2 minutes. She did not make any sound. Ilse Rasmussen closed the trap door above the heads of the Kjellstad family after the last of the 4 children had come down, and she seated the wooden locking bar across the underside, and she came down the ladder herself, and she went to the small shelf in the corner of the chamber where she kept the tin box of matches and the folded stack of clean linen towels. She began without ceremony to make the 10 of them a hot meal. Vidar Sandvik, the Norwegian bachelor from the northwest claim, arrived on the following afternoon on a horse he had kept alive through the storm by bringing it into his kitchen. He had heard through some mechanism of frontier communication that operated even across the most severe conditions that there was warmth at the Rasmussen claim. He did not ask questions. He tied his horse to the woodshed post. He came in through the woodshed door. He found the trap door now no longer concealed. He climbed down. He sat on the chamber floor for 3 hours without saying a word, except to remark once quietly that it was warmer underground than it had been in any house he had slept in that winter. The Almqvist family arrived the following morning. The Roskilde family from the dugout half a mile south arrived that same afternoon. An elderly couple named Norwood, who had been living alone on their claim since their adult son had taken work in Fargo, the previous autumn, arrived on the 3rd day after the storm broke, having spent the last of their firewood the night before, and having walked the 2 miles to the Rasmussen claim across the packed snow in the pale sun of the middle morning, without speaking to each other because they had been married for 47 years and there was nothing left to say between them that had not been said before. At its peak occupancy over 3 days in the middle of January, in the year 1887, the chamber under Ilse Rasmussen's woodshed and the small alcove opening off its eastern wall together sheltered 16 people, 1 dog, 4 hens, and 1 small pig, that the elder of the Norwood couple had refused to leave behind on the grounds that the pig was not going to survive the night in the barn, which was correct. The temperature in the chamber on the coldest night of that occupancy, with all 16 people asleep on wool blankets, and the lantern burning at low flame in the middle of the ceiling, held at 61 degrees. The ventilation held. The thermal wall, which had been doing its slow and patient work since the summer of 1885, held. On the second morning of the second occupancy, Solveig Rasmussen, who was 11 years old, went into the alcove to check on the hens. She came back into the main chamber with her hands cupped carefully in front of her. She stood for a moment at the mouth of the alcove opening. She said in a voice pitched to carry across the whole of the chamber to every person sitting or lying on the wool blankets along both walls, "The hens laid 2 eggs this morning." She said it with the small, quiet triumph of a girl of 11 who has been trusted with a small, important thing and has carried the small, important thing out into the light for everyone to see. The 2 eggs were divided that morning among the 4 smallest of the children. None of the adults asked for a share. The spring of 1887 came slowly. The last of the great storms broke in the 3rd week of February. The temperature began to climb back towards 0 in the 1st week of March, and then above 0 in the 2nd week. And by the last week of March, the snow along the south walls of the sod houses in Pembina County had begun to soften into the dark, heavy consistency that came only when the ground beneath it had begun to release the winter's cold upward through the melt. The neighbors went home. They went home in the small, awkward silence of people who have shared for a period of days a space too small to hold their pride, and who now have to walk back out into the open air and figure out how to speak to each other under an open sky again. Rune Kjelstad came back on the second day of the thaw. He came alone. He rode across the section line at the middle of the morning on the plow horse, and he tied the horse at the edge of Ilse's yard, and he came forward on foot with his hat in his hands, exactly as he had come forward on a September afternoon in the year 1884. He stopped at the same spot in the yard. "I," said Mrs. Rasmussen. She said, "Mr. Kjelstad." He said, "I have been thinking about coming out here for 2 weeks. I am not going to leave it be." She waited. He said, "I was wrong about the winter, Mrs. Rasmussen. I was wrong about a good many things." She looked at him across the small distance of the yard. She looked at the man who had come to her door on a warm September afternoon 2 years and 5 months before, and had told her kindly and with the full weight of his goodwill that she should take her daughters and go back to Minnesota. She looked at the man who had walked a mile and a half through packed snow at 31 below zero to knock on her door and ask for help. She looked at him, and she saw in that moment that the two men were the same man, and that the country had done its slow, patient work on him over the course of the intervening years, and that he was standing in her yard now not to apologize, because a man in that country did not apologize with words, but to say what a man in that country said instead of apologizing, which was that he had been wrong and that he knew he had been wrong, and that he was going to spend the rest of his life not being wrong about that particular thing again. She said most of us were Mr. Kjelstad. She said it not to spare him, but because it was true. He said, "I want to hire you." She said, "Hire me for what?" I said, "To build me one, under my own woodshed, before the coming winter." She looked at him. She said, "I will build you one. I will not build it under your woodshed. Your woodshed faces the wrong way, and the wall you would have to break through is the load-bearing wall of your barn. I will build it under the north end of your smokehouse. You will pay me $12 for the design and $8 a week for the labor, which I will do myself with your help on the digging, and it will take 6 weeks in the middle of July when the ground is dry and the girls can be spared. Do we have an agreement?" Rune Kjelstad looked at her. I was a big man on a large plow horse, and he had held a small piece of land in Dakota Territory for 18 years, and he had been for most of those 18 years a man who did not take instructions from women. I looked at Ilse Rasmussen. I said, "We have an agreement." She said, "You will bring your wagon on the 15th of July. I said, "I will." He put his hat back on his head. He mounted the plow horse. He rode back the way he had come. Ilse watched him go over the low rise to the east until the shape of him was lost against the pale spring sky, and then she turned and she went back into the sod house, and she sat down at the small pine table, and she wrote out in her careful hand the list of materials she would need for the construction on the Kjelstad claim. She paid off the last $48 of her debt to Prescott in the middle of October. She paid it partly from the sale of 2 calves she had raised from Solve, and partly from the $12 Rune Kjelstad had given her for the design of his own chamber, and partly from the $48 in wages he had paid her over the 6 weeks of the labor. Prescott at his counter wrote out the receipt without meeting her eye. He did not say anything about the 6 other claims he had signed into his own name over the previous 10 years. He did not say anything about the small locked cabinet in the back of the store. He said only that her account was clear, and he handed her the receipt, and she folded it and put it inside the front of her dress, and she walked out of the store and did not go back into it for the rest of that autumn. She lived on the claim for another 22 years. She died in the small back room of the sod house in the winter of 1909 at the age of 56 of a chest cold that would not shake, with both her daughters beside her and with a folded piece of brown paper in her hand that she had unfolded and refolded so many times over the intervening years that the fabric of the paper had gone soft as cloth. Solveig Rasmussen, who was 34 years old when her mother died, and who had learned everything her mother had ever known about the construction of below-ground shelters over the course of those September days, in the woodshed in the autumn of 1884, and every summer of the 25 years that had followed, had by that date already taught the method to 2 other women in the small scattered community of Pembina County, before her own marriage in 1897, and she would go on to teach it to 7 more women in the county over the course of the following decade. Elin Rasmussen, who was 32 years old when her mother died, and who had spent the whole of the storm of January 1887 curled against her mother's side on a wool blanket at the base of the thermal wall, and who had grown up into a small, quiet woman with her father's dark hair and her mother's careful gray eyes, had taken a teaching post at the small schoolhouse in the town of Park River in the autumn of 1898, and had held that post for the whole of her working life. She never married. She lived alone in a small, clean room above the schoolhouse, and she taught 2 generations of children the small, essential things a country teacher teaches. And on certain particular mornings in the deep of January, when the temperature outside her schoolroom window had dropped below zero, and the wind had a note in it that the smallest of her students did not yet know how to listen for, she would sometimes stop in the middle of a lesson and set her chalk down on the ledge of the blackboard and turn to face the room, and she would tell the children the story of the winter her mother had kept 16 people warm underground while the temperature above their heads had held at 38 below zero for 3 days. She always ended the story the same way, not with the numbers, not with the engineering, not with any account of the frost mortar or the venturi shaft or the 47 river stones stacked against the western wall. She ended it with a single image that had stayed with her, she said, for 60 years. The image of an oil lantern burning steadily in an 8-foot chamber under a forgotten woodshed on the northern plains, surrounded by 16 people who had nowhere else to go, and the flame not flickering. Not once, not even when the worst of it came. Because the earth, if you are willing to go deep enough, does not shake. And a woman who knows that and who builds accordingly does not need the cold to give her permission.